Hi all, we'll be starting the Delta Phi webinar in just a moment. Before we get started, I'm just going to go through a little bit of logistics. So the first half of the session, we will do some introductions and we'll have speakers. We'll have a little short break, and after that short break, we will go into question and answer. For the question and answer session, that will be moderated. So if you do have questions, please use the question and answer box within Zoom. It should be at the bottom of your panel to ask any questions. This session is being recorded, so those who are registered will have access, to the recording should you lose your connection or have to step away during the session. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Bagger, the CEO of the American Physical Society, to open up the webinar.
Well, so thank you, Geraldine. And I would like to welcome the audience to today's webinar about the impact of research security concerns regarding China on the physics community. We are hosting this webinar today in cooperation with our partners at the American Institute of Physics and the American Association of Physics Teachers. This presentation is the latest in a series of conversations on race that we have hosted since the murders last summer of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others. It is being recorded, as were the others, so it will soon be available to anyone who couldn't attend on the APS website. With today's discussion, we will shift our focus from anti-Black to anti-Asian racism, and in particular to the impact of U.S. China tensions on the Asian community here in the United States. And I know that these conversations can be difficult and emotional, so I ask that all participants be mindful of the APS Code of Conduct for meetings and that the discussion be conducted with the dignity and respect that it deserves. And now I'll turn the mic over to APS President, Professor Jim Gates. Jim is the Ford Foundation Professor of Physics at Brown University and Director of the Brown Theoretical Physics Center. A recipient of the National Medal of Science, he was a member of President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. This webinar is indeed a continuation, and let me say a few words about what's going on here. First of all, I think we can all agree that science is humanity's survival instinct. If we didn't believe that, we were certainly reminded of that fact by how our world and our species has responded to the challenge of the COVID pandemic. Within a year, science has stepped up to the plate to provide relief. Delta Phi started, as mentioned by Jonathan, last summer on 24 June, where we had our first webinar to discuss this. Delta Phi is an effort to do a rather interesting thing. The APS has different affinity groups, committees, fora, divisions, and we want to have this as a commons where cross-cutting issues can be discussed in a timely manner. We have future challenges to face. Among those, professional standards, ethics, and a host of other issues. We want to treat them all as elements of culture, and that's why they're on the target for future activities. Let me just remind our audience that last Wednesday, Eric Lander was appointed the Science Advisor of the United States of America, the first such individual to hold cabinet level appointment. He was sworn in on a text called the Pirkei Avot, which is a 1492 edition of writings of Jewish scholars. Let me quote from that because I think it's most appropriate as we look through the beginning of this. Eric's comment was, the world has experimented with intolerance, with the view that everybody has to think like I think, worship like I work. But the world experimented in 1492 with tolerance, with the idea that we would have a diversity of people and perspectives. I think the lessons of 1492 are the lessons for today, coming together and making our diversity an incredible asset for this country going forward. He ended by saying, we will not be able to finish this work, but we must start. And so this is APS's effort. to contribute to this start. With that, I'm going to turn the control back over to Geraldine.
Thanks, Jim. So I appreciate the mention of race here, because regardless of the issue that's being discussed, when it has the impact of minoritizing a particular racial or ethnic group, and by minoritizing, I mean preventing or discouraging their full participation in physics, then this becomes an issue of climate and inclusion. When an issue results in the marginalization of any racial or ethnic group, and I'll actually extend that to say any group based on any demographic marker of difference, this impacts all of us because it prevents us from having the inclusive environment that we want. The speakers today are going to share some pretty powerful stories with us. So I'm really glad to see so many people in attendance to hear those stories. And my hope is that it not only raises awareness of the issue, but it moves people to action. I think about the words of Bishop Desmond Tutu. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So my hope is that we are all choosing the side of social justice and thinking about what we might be able to do to address these issues that cause any racial or ethnic group to feel to be minoritized and marginalized within the physics community. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Andrea Liu. And just by way of a short introduction, Andrea is a soft and living matter theorist at the University of Pennsylvania and also the past speaker of the American Physical Societies Council. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. And I want to also particularly thank you for your really great advice as we've been preparing for this webinar. And also to thank you and the APS staff, particularly communications, for working extremely hard on a very, very short timeline to make this webinar happen. Geraldine explained to me that this happened because she and the others feel a fierce urgency because this webinar is occurring in the context of attacks on Asian Americans that are multiplying across the US. So I want to just say a few more words about what anti-Asian racism has to do with research security concerns over China. The fact is that racist stereotypes about Chinese really feed in perfectly into the fear that Chinese students and scientists are spies. So first of all, the perception of Chinese as obedient. It's somehow easier to think that a scientist of Chinese descent is obedient to the Chinese government than it is to think that a scientist of Russian descent, for example, is obedient to the Russian government. The sort of stereotype of Chinese as being inscrutable, sneaky, dishonest cheaters, they all feed into this as well. Those of us who are of Asian descent and born in the US know very well that we are viewed as perpetual foreigners. And this is why, for example, even third generation Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. So we're starting today with research security. That's the single biggest issue for Asian and Asian American physicists right now, but we're not stopping there. The next webinar in this series will be by Steve Chu, former Secretary of Energy under Obama, and of course, Nobel laureate for laser trapping of atoms. And he'll be talking about the benefits of immigration to US science and the dangers of the present course that we're on to US leadership in science. Let me just also share my screen to show you another series of webinars that will be starting in July. This emphasis, this whole thing is occurring in the context of tension over immigration, and we have the APS is rolling out a series of broadcasts on for career development for international scientists starting in July. And there'll be more webinars in this series on Asian American issues. Animus against Chinese easily translates into attacks on anyone who could be of East Asian descent, because after all, we all look alike. But we do plan to hold more webinars on topics that matter to the broad spectrum of Asian Americans, and also on intersectionality of different identities, for example, Black and Asian identity, race and gender identity, etc. So today, it's Chinese scientists who are being singled out for suspicion. But When any group is singled out for poor treatment, as Geraldine said, it hurts all of us and it hurts science. And we all need to band together to push back. So that's why we're having this webinar. So let's move to our first speaker. Xiaoxing, do you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen? Xiaoxing Shi is the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Physics at Temple University. He is an experimental condensed matter physicist and a recipient of an APS fellow and also a recipient of the 2020 Andrei Sakharov Prize at the APS for reasons that you will learn about shortly. Go ahead, Xiaoxing. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will present to you some information, including my own personal experience, to give you an idea about the challenges university professors in the US face, given the current research security concerns regarding China. I am definitely not trying to be alarmist, but we need to be clear-eyed. Right before leaving office, former President Trump issued the National Security Presidential Memorandum NSPM 33, directing federal agencies, universities, and individual scientists to protect national security in government-funded R&D from China. It was accompanied by the so-called J-Core report, a guideline issued by the White House to the funding agencies and universities for implementing NSPM 33. This followed many criminal prosecutions of university professors who allegedly failed to disclose their activities in China. In 2018, the Department of Justice established the China Initiative to prioritize economic espionage cases related to China. A vast majority of the professors charged under the China Initiative are ethnically Chinese. In the view of the FBI, Chinese students, postdocs, and professors are suspected to non-traditional collectors or spies for China, as is stated in this FBI documents published in 2019. Being suspected as spies for China can lead to being charged as spies for China. I myself am a victim of such suspicions. On May 21st, 2015, FBI agents raided my house in the early morning and took me away in handcuffs. The frightening scenes played out right in front of my wife and daughters, who were rounded up at gunpoint by the armed agents. Based on emails I had sent from my Temple University address, the federal government charged me for passing sensitive US company technology to China. The charges were totally false. I had never shared the US company technology with anyone in China. The emails I sent were about entirely different things. They were about academic collaborations based on my own widely published research. When it became clear that the government had falsely charged me, it dropped the case. But our life had been wrecked, professionally, emotionally, physically, and financially. This horrific experience taught me valuable lessons that I have been eager to tell everyone about. Lesson number one, when you see a DOJ news release charging someone for stealing secrets for China, it is not necessarily true. When the federal government charges someone with crimes, it is natural for people to think that the charges are the fact that he or she must have done something wrong. However, it is important for us to remember that one, the person charged is presumed innocent until proven guilty. And two, what the government says is not necessarily true. In my case, what the government said was totally false. Lesson number two, innocent Chinese American scientists are being unfairly targeted. Researching while Chinese carries tremendous risks. You don't have to do anything wrong to be charged as a Chinese spy. And the China Initiative puts a target on the back of any scientist with Chinese ethnicity. Lesson number three, the DOJ is criminalizing academic collaborations with China. It was clear to me during my interrogation by the FBI agents that they knew nothing about how science is done, and they saw routine academic activities as criminal. According to a key official on the DOJ's China Initiative, academic collaborations with China is by definition conveying sensitive information to the Chinese. You don't have to be a Chinese. Anyone who has an academic collaboration with Chinese colleagues can become a target of the FBI. Once you are a target, your email will be read, your phone will be tapped, and everything you have ever done in your life will be under the microscope. And the China initiative makes sure that the FBI has enough resources to do it. My case is just one of many cases that involve Chinese professors or those who have interactions with scientists in China. Here is the list of all reported cases over the years. The enhanced focus on prosecuting Chinese or China-related cases began before the China initiative. It started in the Obama administration. However, the number of criminal prosecutions is significantly higher in the last couple of years. It is no surprise. The Assistant Attorney General in charge of the China initiative said that he expected prosecutions to be brought in each of the 94 U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. So there is a quota to be met. If you read the court documents of each case, sometimes you could find out how the case was started. Early on, it was mostly somebody, shown in color blue, who contacted the FBI. For Yiheng Jiang, it was a former employee who had a falling out with him. For Feng Tao, it was a Chinese visiting scholar who was not happy about the authorship of a paper. In my case, we don't know who did it for sure, but we have theories. Since the China initiative, you don't need anybody to accuse you. It seems that federal agents, shown in color red, are actively looking for targets. If you look at the research fields of the professors being charged, you see many engineering departments and some medical schools, but there are also several science departments. The field of the Chinese professor being charged most recently is as basic as mathematics. If you look at the crimes being charged, only 2 earlier cases, including mine, were for theft of intellectual property, shown in color red. And both cases were dropped because they were false. The government charged Ning Xi for irregular travel reimbursement, but the trial ended in a mistrial, and the case was dropped. The government learned from these failures, and at some point decided that non-disclosure of China ties, shown in color blue, is a sure way to charge professors with felony crimes. In Yu Dongzhu's case in 2013, failure to disclose China tie was a misdemeanor charge, and he was sentenced to no prison time and $5,000 fine. In a recent case of non-disclosure, Song Guozheng was sentenced to 37 months in prison and ordered to pay $3.8 million. The J1 visa fraud for G.K. Chen is a new charge. He allegedly hired Chinese students and postdocs on J1 visas to work at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, but the work was done at the Chinese company ZTE's lab in New Jersey. Let us hear the perspectives of a former federal prosecutor about such cases.
The great argument that the department and the federal government have made in bringing these cases is that these are about protecting American intellectual property, taxpayer-funded research. And the cases that they have brought to date do not support that theory. They are not theft of trade secrets cases. They are not espionage cases. They are really grant disclosure, failing to disclose cases. And they just have not put forth the evidence that shows that any of these researchers were involved with stealing research, stealing American IP technology, and giving it to the Chinese. This has not been an area of criminal prosecution before the China initiative. And they have essentially weaponized grant disclosure errors, which before were handled administratively by the NIH or by the federal granting agencies. They've essentially made these federal cases what they consider to be espionage or national security type cases. All of this is under the umbrella that the unsaid reason why these researchers have not done the disclosures properly is because that they are non-traditional collectors or that they are somehow spies on campus, which when you go talk to the researchers, you realize it's patently absurd. I mean, most of these researchers will tell you they're not working on classified science. They're working on fundamental research. And the point of fundamental research is that you do your research and then it is published for the whole world to see.
So these prosecutions are not about protecting American intellectual property. The DOJ has weaponized grant disclosure because it thinks Chinese professors are spies for China, but cannot prove it. Now listen to the perspectives of a former FBI agent.
When the Justice Department creates a national initiative that it calls the China Initiative, it creates a pressure on FBI field offices to work cases targeting people who they can put under the umbrella of the China Initiative. So if somebody's only connection to China is their national origin or their ancestry, that's often enough to fit under this umbrella. And my concern is that it promotes racial profiling of Asian people, particularly Chinese people. So if I'm looking skeptically at any Chinese scientist or technologist because I'm working this China initiative and I can't find that they have orders from the Chinese government to engage in some kind of misconduct or doing anything to benefit the Chinese government, but simply engaged in some kind of minor misconduct unrelated, I can still charge those cases and claim a statistical accomplishment under the China initiative, rather than laying significant charges of economic espionage or theft of intellectual property. What we see them doing is laying very minor charges, which is both an indication that this isn't a person who properly engaged in the type of activity that justified the investigation in the first place, and seems to be part of this disruption strategy, that we can't prove that they're engaged in any kind of serious misconduct, but because of our bias that this is a problem, we can't be sure. So let's bring these minor charges just to damage them professionally. And that, of course, is not an appropriate thing for the Justice Department to be doing.
So China Initiative promotes racial profiling. Criminal charges for things like non-disclosure, irregular air travel receipts, or visa request are meant to disrupt and damage Chinese professors. Short of criminal prosecution, professors are also being fired and forced to resign or retire for failure to disclose China ties. The NIH deputy director boasted about its success at a recent Senate hearing, saying that over 100 scientists have been removed from the NIH ecosystem. News media reports that universities are suspending or terminating their professors for failure to disclose without finding of guilt or even a chance to defend themselves. I'm sure many of you know of such horror stories. At the White House level, if you read the J-Corps report, the guidelines for universities on research security, you'll find recommendations referring to insider threat, disclosure upon hiring, reporting to the FBI, escorting foreign visitors and scholars, digital persistent identifiers, loaner computer and the pre-travel briefing for foreign travels, and so on. It's trying to run our universities like government weapon labs. The message sent by the all-encompassing disclosure requirements is very clear. Don't have any interaction with Chinese scientists. Over in the Congress, where laws are made, many bills on research security have been introduced. Some of these bills, like the Endless Frontier Act currently working through the Senate, might have a good chance of becoming law. If not, a bill can be reintroduced in the next Congress. In 2019, a Senate subcommittee report recommended updating NSDD 199, our national policy that keeps fundamental research open and the sharing of its results unrestricted. The chair of the subcommittee introduced the Safeguarding American Innovation Act that would make it a federal crime for failing to disclose China ties and require universities to report what sensitive technologies a foreign researcher will have access to. The Endless Frontier Act prohibits federal funding for anyone who participates in the government talent programs of China, North Korea, Russia, or Iran. They are also forbidden to use services or facilities that get federal funding, which is practically everything. The Secure Campus Act would ban visas for STEM students from China. The Higher Education Research Protection Act introduced in the House would create positions in every FBI field office whose job is singularly focused on Chinese espionage at universities. To be clear, we are not denying there are research security concerns regarding China. In 2019, the NSF commissioned a study on fundamental research security from JASON, an independent group of preeminent scientists that conducts mostly classified studies on science and technology matters for the US government. Based on the classified and unclassified intelligence information provided to the group, Jason concluded that foreign influences by China through rewards, deception, coercion, and theft all occur to some degree, but how frequently they occur was not clear. The foreign influence in fundamental research can be addressed within the framework of research integrity, not by walling off fundamental research. The Jason report made 9 specific recommendations to protect fundamental research security, which I believe should be the basis for our national policy on scientific relationship with China. To give you my personal opinion on the outlook, I think the US is trending towards an environment with substantial reduction or elimination of Chinese students in the STEM fields, severe punishment for researchers who collaborate with Chinese colleagues, difficulties for ethnically Chinese scientists to have a career in the US, substantial or complete academic decoupling with China, and significant restrictions on open fundamental research on university campuses. Fundamentally, such policy have broad support from the American public. For example, 55% of Americans support limiting Chinese students studying in the US. To change this trend, we, the scientific community, need to speak up and tell the public and the policymakers that Chinese scientists, academics, and students are not spies for China, but rather important contributors to America's economic security and the national security. Whether the US and China are in a Cold War or hot war, it is wrong for the law enforcement to profile Chinese students, scientists, and professors based on where they come from. We need to tell people that rejecting talents and shutting down open exchanges on fundamental research hurt America more than anyone else. Speaking up is the only thing we can do and we must do. Thank you, and back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Xiaoxing. It was great. So the next speaker will be Francis Slakey. He's the Chief External Affairs Officer of the APS, fellow of the APS. And I didn't learn this until recently, but he's the author of To the Last Breath, a book about summiting the highest peak on every continent and surfing every ocean. So I bought that and I look forward to reading it. So Slake will tell us about what the APS has been doing on this issue. Thanks very much, Slake.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to speak first to any Chinese students who are joining us today. Some of you, I am sure, are experiencing anxiety. Some of you are dismayed or angry about recent US federal policies or what you've seen in the news, or sadly, what you may have experienced in your own neighborhoods. And for some of you, it must be terribly frustrating that things are happening all around you, but you have no voice. You have no way that you can have impact on the decisions that are being made by the US Congress or the administration. Well, let me tell you that while you may at times feel that you have no voice, the entire APS leadership and more than 6,000 APS members are speaking for you. And here's what I mean. Over the last 8 months, more than 6,000 APS members have picked up their phone and called Congress. They sent personalized emails to their representatives and senators. They sent messages directly to the Trump administration, and they have done all of that to combat proposals that impact our international students and our researchers, all with the goal of building a stronger, collaborative physics community. Now, in some cases, their efforts have paid off, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but most importantly, what I want every student, every researcher of Chinese descent who's joining us today to know is this. There may be times when you feel silenced, but we are your voice, and we are 6,000 voices strong. Now, of course, the problems we're discussing today impact more than just our fellow students and our physicists of Chinese descent. We know that US policies over the past year are impacting the very nature of our scientific enterprise. APS recognizes that, and we issued a statement about it. And I want to share that statement with you so you can take a look at it yourself. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put it in the chat right now. So there it is. Take a look. And as you get that up on your screen, let me just draw your attention to one line. Now it's in the second paragraph. It's the fourth line down. Can you see that? So for those of you who don't have the link in front of you, I just want to read this one line. Unfair treatment of a segment of our physics community based on national or ethnic origin is antithetical to our values and should not be tolerated. And APS is not tolerating it, which means we don't just issue statements, we take action. Last summer, we mobilized thousands of our APS members who made phone calls to Congress, had meetings with congressional staff, sent emails to members of Congress, all to preserve the optional practical training program that is critical to the careers of international students in the US. And it was under threat by the Trump administration. And we won. We won. OPT was left untouched. And last July, we went to the courts and we opposed the implementation of a Trump plan that would prevent a particular set of international students from coming or staying in the US. So APS drafted a legal brief. We rallied 16 other science organizations to join us, and we presented it to the court. We weren't alone in the fight, and by working together, we won that court battle. You know, and I remember when I got the news from Phil Buxbaum, who was APS president at that time. He was actually watching it live when the judge made the announcement on July 14th of 2020. We won. And I sat back in my chair and just sighed with relief. But we have not won every battle we fought. And we have to continue to work with Congress and the Biden administration to get things to a better place. But we are not at that better place yet. So let me tell you briefly the problems that we face as APS sees it. And I'm going to be very frank as I do that. In fact, what I will tell you today is exactly what we are saying in meetings with the White House, with leadership at NSF, with leadership at DOE, State Department, Congress. I'm going to tell you exactly what we are telling them and what we're asking for, so you know precisely what the APS perspective is. So here is our perspective. The federal government is concerned about research security, as they should be. They're concerned about IP theft, about espionage, about foreign inducements that might lure students or researchers and entrap them. And it's appropriate for the federal government to be concerned about all of those things. But the problem APS has is not that the government is concerned about those things. The problem we have is with the approach the government is taking in response to those concerns. So when I say we have a problem with the approach, here's what I mean. There is evident national security or economic risk when there is IP theft. There is evident national security or economic risk when there is espionage. But the federal government has provided no compelling evidence. They have not provided a single compelling case that non-disclosure of foreign grants by researchers is a threat to US national security. And I say that having had the briefing from the FBI on these issues. And without any compelling explanation of why non-disclosure is a threat to national security, the current punishment the federal government is imposing doesn't even fit the crime. And here's what I mean. Researchers are being prosecuted for things that don't appear to create any national security risk, but are instead more appropriately described as breaches of scientific ethics. Now, I'm going to say more about ethics in a moment, but let me give you some perspective on the consequences of the approach that the Department of Justice has taken. So we have all just heard the tragic details of Professor Chi's case. And now let me remind you of the broader impact by saying just one number, okay? And it's the reason I keep mentioning non-disclosure. Of all the cases that have proceeded to actual arrests of researchers under the Department of Justice's so-called China initiative, in more than 70% of the cases, the only charge has been non-disclosure. Let me say that again. In more than 70% of the cases, the only charge has been non-disclosure. And not only does the punishment not fit that crime in all of those cases, the punishment and the resulting demand and scrutiny that are being put on researchers around disclosure are actually having a chilling effect on international collaborations. We're seeing it happen. We've been alerted to cases of administrators at universities who have counseled researchers to cease their collaborations in order to avoid any scrutiny by funding agencies. So that is a terrible outcome. That's just self-inflicted harm. That is damaging the US's own scientific capability. But it doesn't stop there. So we're now seeing a dramatic decline in international graduate student enrollment to US physics departments. Not because those students have been personally targeted by the US government. It's because those students see what's happening here. They are seeing what's happening to fellow scientists who are being targeted. And we've actually surveyed those international students who have chosen not to come here. And more than 30% of them are telling us that they are staying away from the US because they regard the US as, and I quote, unwelcoming to foreigners. And a final concern we have about the approach the government has taken is that our Chinese colleagues have been disproportionately impacted by the federal actions. So over the last 2 years, in the majority of Department of Justice cases against researchers, the charges have been against ethnically Chinese scientists. And in at least 6 of those cases, the charges were later dropped without explanation after the lives of those Chinese scientists were just disastrously impacted. So for all of those reasons I just mentioned, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. The process is negatively impacting international collaborations. The atmosphere is dissuading international students from coming to the US. The charges are disproportionately impacting Chinese scientists. And so importantly, innocent scientists have been caught up in all of this. So for all of those reasons, we're pushing the administration and members of Congress to take a new approach. And here it is. We are asking that we enable the scientific community, universities, research institutions, professional science organizations like APS, to take on a greater role in disseminating and reinforcing adherence to ethical principles of research. And in turn, the government should reduce the role of law enforcement and the justice system in attempting to prosecute researchers for potential ethics violations. We've put this concept on paper. I'm going to share it with you now. I'm going to put the link in the chat. So there it is. This is what we're seeing. If you put it up on your screen, this is what we are presenting to the White House, to the National Science Foundation, DOE, State Department, and Congress. For those of you who can't actually access the link right now, I'll summarize it. In our view, the government should keep basic research open to the maximum extent possible, and in turn, the scientific community plays an active role in disseminating and reinforcing adherence to ethical principles of research. Now, you may have a question about this. There's a natural question to ask. Would what we're proposing make any difference at all? If the APS takes on a greater role in disseminating and reinforcing adherence to ethical principles of research, would it make a difference? Well, there's reason to be hopeful. So in our discussions with leadership at DOE when we presented this, their comment is, this is a direct quote, "We can't arrest our way to a solution." They agree. In our discussions with the National Science Foundation leadership, they agree. The community must find a way to take this on. So to answer the question, would enhancing our role make a difference? The answer seems to be yes. Now, you may be wondering what is driving the administration's actions on research security. And most recently, 2 documents were issued during the final days of the Trump administration, but they are still serving as guidance in the Biden administration, and it's NSPM 33 and the associated recommended practices. Professor Shi mentioned both of those in the very first slide of his talk. I want to just revisit those documents for just a moment. And incidentally, the word disclosure is mentioned 57 times in those 2 documents. So disclosure remains the front and center issue in the Biden administration. So we've spoken to White House staff about this guidance, and let me tell you exactly what we've said. First, we acknowledge some good things about it. Okay, so if if we're going to have a few foundational ethical principles that guide the research enterprise, the ones that are cited in those documents seem appropriate. In fact, they're entirely consistent with our own APS guideline on ethics. Second, there's an attempt here to establish a process that's multi-agency. So there's uniformity and consistency across agencies. We support that as well. We don't want NSF requiring one thing, DOE requiring another. So both of those are good things, and they're important things that are guiding administration action. However, there are some significant problems. So one of them is their perspective is that one size fits all. So there's no real substantial recognition of differences between national labs and universities, large-scale collaborations in tabletop physics, differences between postdocs or graduate students or PIs. Everything is being treated the same for the most part, and that's a mistake from our point of view. There are big differences and they require different responses. Second problem is the guidance continues to assert threats without assessing them or providing any compelling examples that will command the attention of researchers around disclosure. And then finally, they treat the violations the same way. They all present the same risk, as I mentioned earlier, the problems with that. Certainly, there is national security and economic risk in the cases of IP theft, theft of classified information, or research espionage. But what is the threat to the US due to a researcher's inadequate disclosure of a talent contract? That it jeopardizes the national security of the US? That's not apparent. That it's grounds for arrest for taking someone out of their home in handcuffs? Certainly not. Particularly when in so many of those cases, the charges have been dropped, but only after they have had a terribly damaging impact on the scientists and the scientific enterprise. So let me just summarize with this point. We think the best end state is for the scientific community to take on a greater role in disseminating and reinforcing adherence to ethical principles of research. And in turn, the federal government allows basic research to remain open to the maximum extent possible, and only applying classification as the method of managing information in cases where there is evident national security risk. That's the end state that we're pushing for. So let me close with just this one last point. The reason the APS is fighting so hard for a fair and just policy is very simple. What happens to any one of us happens to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Slade. That was really terrific. All right, so our next speaker is David Gross. David is the Chancellor's Chair Professor of Theoretical Physics at UC Santa Barbara. He's a high energy theorist who is, of course, also a Nobel laureate for asymptotic freedom and recipient of too many other honors for me to possibly name. But for this purpose, he is former president of the APS and organizer of the U.S. China Roundtable, which he will tell us about next. Thank you, David.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. So I'd like to make, I have very little time, 3 brief remarks about racism and xenophobia, the U.S. China relations, and an effort the APS is engaged in direct discussions with Chinese colleagues. Xenophobia, of course, is not new in America. Almost all immigrant groups to the US have been targeted, starting with Native Americans, Black Americans, Irish, Italians, Germans, Jews, all of us. And now the focus has been on the despicable, outrageous discrimination against Asian Americans of all kinds, but we're mostly concerned with these efforts directed at our colleagues in science. Historically, one lesson we can learn is that the best way, the only way, in fact, to deal with this is to fight back. And politics is crucial. In a democracy, one has political power, and it's only via political power that these xenophobic racist attacks have been dealt with to some degree. They continue, of course. Now, this is enormously exacerbated by the worsening relations between the United States and China, which for the last 40 years have been quite reasonable and beneficial to both, but recently have become under attack for a variety of reasons. In my opinion, there's an enormous danger that we are headed towards a Cold War and perhaps an even hotter war with China for no good reason. There are, of course, conflicts and disagreements between two superpowers, but the idea that a war, a cutthroat competition that might exhibit itself in actual armed conflict is inevitable, is gaining ground at the highest levels of our government. And this, in my opinion, is extremely dangerous. It makes no sense. And in the nuclear age, it could lead to total disaster. That is something we must fight against as citizens, but what we're concerned with here mostly is its impact on the anti-Asian xenophobia and on science. The coupling of racism with national security is extremely dangerous. Our Asian colleagues are being suspected to be inherently, as Andrea said, suspicious and perhaps owing loyalty to a foreign country, which is nonsense. But it poses a deep problem in dealing with such racism. Our Chinese colleagues are being asked, are you loyal to the United States? We suspect that you're not simply because you're of Asian descent. This causes extreme pressure on our friends and must be resisted with all our efforts. This especially is critical for those of us who are engaged in scientific research. We know in our bones how important openness, transparency, collaboration, cooperation is in science. It is, of course, enormously beneficial for science, but also for our respective countries. The close scientific collaboration that we've had with all countries, but enormously with China over the last few decades, has been enormously beneficial to the U.S. scientific effort and the U.S. economy, as well as to China. It's completely a win-win situation, and efforts to shut us off from foreign collaborations, and especially China, will be, we all know, will be extremely bad for science and for the U.S. and the U.S. economy. We must resist this, and we must speak out forcefully against xenophobia and against the absurdity and the stupidity of such policies. Now, Slake has discussed the various efforts of the APS, which are extremely important. This is a great forum. We have a lot of respect in the halls of Congress and in Washington. That is based on the participation of, over 50,000 physicists throughout the United States. And to all of you, especially those of you who are being targeted directly, you must stand up, get engaged, participate, speak out, and help in this effort. Behind the scenes, the APS, we've started a roundtable, a U.S. China roundtable on physics, where we have informal, frank, honest, and collegial discussions with Chinese physicists, Chinese colleagues in China. This is somewhat analogous to the Pugwash conferences that were held during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where US and American physicists had discussions about science and arms control and contributed greatly to the relaxation of tensions over nuclear policy. And we have been carrying out such conversations with Chinese colleagues, trying to find ways among ourselves to deal with some of the security issues that have been raised and are causing such harm, and to overcome what, if anyone can design a reasonable policy with respect to national security, disclosure, transparency, it should be the scientists who actually know how science works and have an interest in good relations. And we think we can contribute to that discussion and have influence with our respective governments. This is necessarily a private and behind the scenes discussion, but it is ongoing and hopefully can be very helpful. But again, let me just urge you all, our Chinese Americans, our Chinese visitors and colleagues, and all Americans, that this is our fight and we must fight back. The only way to treat bullies is to stand up and fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. This is really great. Okay, so our next speaker is Sean Xingsheng. He's a professor of physics at Brown University, an experimental condensed matter physicist, fellow of the APS, and participant in the 1000 Talents program, which has been singled out for particular suspicion. So thank you so much, Sean. Go ahead and unmute, please.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Andrea, for inviting me. So yes, I am the only speaker here who actually directly participated in this very controversial Chinese program called the 1000 Talent program. First, a little bit about myself. I came to United States in 1987 as a graduate student, and then I, after a PhD and a postdoc, and I came to Brown as an assistant professor in 1996. So at that time, then I was ready to settle in the US and build a career here. And then in year 2000, after seeing my elementary school children pledge their allegiance to the United States flag, then I realized, my wife and I, we realized we needed to make a decision about which side we're going to be on. So we became an American citizen. We pledged our allegiance to the United States. Okay, so first off, regarding the loyalty Professor David Gross was just referring to, so that on that part, that's very clear. Okay, so some of my Chinese colleagues did call me a traitor, but nevertheless, that's where my loyalty stands. Okay, so regarding my participation in the China 1000 Talent program, so in 2012, so to make a long story short, my research grant renewal was rejected by NIH. So I'm an experimentalist. As you know, that for experimentalists, when your grant is not funded, you are in a big hole. And what are you going to do? You can't support a student. You cannot buy materials. You can't do experiment. And then you don't have new data. And then if you submit a proposal, the reviewer will say, hey, you don't have data, so you're not serious, so you will not get funded. So this is a negative feedback loop. Then it's guaranteed the end of your research career. So obviously in that moment, when you are desperate, anyone throw you a straw, you would grab it as a lifesaver. So in 2012, a friend suggested I apply to the China 1000 Talent program, and I did. And then I was I thought I was lucky. I got it, and then I told them I gave the all the document to my department chair and to the dean of faculty at Brown University. I said, either you make me a dead wood for the next 30 years since I'm tenured, or you let me go to China and then try to save my career. And they said, go ahead and save your career. So I went to China. And then, so initially I was supposed to go to Institute of Physics in Beijing, but to make story simple is I didn't go for various reasons. And then in 2015, Southeast University of Nanjing agreed to let me to have a part-time arrangement with them. And then my department arranged me to have a double teaching in the previous semester and let me go to China the semester after. So I went to China and then did my 3-year term. And during that time, I felt I have solved what's called a nanopore DNA sequencing. In my view, my approach. Okay, so that's the in the field of that field, there's a competition between my approach and then other people's approach, the Oxford nanopore approach. Okay, so my approach failed to gain support at NIH, and then the Oxford approach won. So I had no choice. Okay. So then in 2018, when I was finishing up, and then another university in China, Suzhou University, the president said, if you can convince your Nobel laureate colleague to come here to Suzhou to give lectures, and then we will give you money to do whatever you want. And at that time, I wanted to go back to low temperature physics. That was my PhD about, my postdoc about, is a field that when I was hired at Brown in 1996, and quantum computing using superconductors was a very cold field and no one wants to fund it. So I was forced to move to soft condensed matter to get my career, to get a tenure. But back this stage, I wanted to go back to low temperature physics. So I went to my provost. The provost said, I will support you. So how much money you need? I said, I need $600,000. He said, no way, I can give you $6,000, not $600,000. Okay, so then, so basically, the university gave me consent to continue my collaboration with China. So I have, during the last 3 years, every summer I would go to Suzhou to do research. We have a couple of papers, and in fact, we have a PRL accepted today, and then hopefully you guys will enjoy it. This is something that my Contextualists and I have discussed for a long time, but we couldn't get the money to do experiment. So we shared this idea with my Chinese colleagues at Suzhou University, Professor Zhexin Zhang and Huaguang Wang, and then they hired a student and we did the experiment, and the result was spectacular. Okay, so the paper, I believe, is very important. It's settled a very important question in the field. So I consider the collaboration with China is very important to my scientific livelihood. And I hope the US government doesn't stop us. So my message to the US government is stop harassing us. And please, if you want to protect the United States position as a leader in science, invest in science in America. So then we don't have to go to desperate places to look for support. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, so last we have Professor Xiaoliang Qi from Stanford. He's a theoretical condensed matter physicist, and please go ahead, Xiaoliang. Thanks.
Yeah, first I would like to thank APS and the organizers of this webinar very much. I really appreciate the efforts of APS. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this important event. To give a brief introduction to myself, I came to the US in 2007 after finishing my PhD in Tsinghua University in China. And after that, I have been mainly at Stanford most of the time, working on theoretical physics. I feel like compared to the previous speakers, I don't really have any special expertise that I can contribute to this webinar. but maybe that means I can share my experience and thoughts as yet another ordinary physicist who came to US from China. So over the years, it has been 14 years since I came to US. I have been focusing on research and rarely paid much attention to politics because I always felt like I'm just a foreigner, a newcomer, and I knew too little about everything. So I will pay attention to things but never speak up. And I followed the cases related to the China initiative in recent years with concerns, but always I felt like I don't know enough to say anything. But the things has changed this year when I read about the case of Professor Gang Chen at MIT. I read the documents of the case carefully, and I'm simply scared by how many normal research activities, such as writing recommendation letters and serving as a referee, these kind of things are included in the official file of a criminal complaint. I felt like very concerned because independent from the output of the legal case, which is still going on, independent from that output, such actions are sending a signal that nobody is safe. It's purposely, I think, sending a signal that nobody is safe. Maybe it's, and on the other hand, maybe that's also because I finally feel like I'm old enough, I can't pretend I'm a newcomer anymore. So I reached out to my Stanford colleagues to really just to seek for help. I was feeling very worried, and I'm seeking for their support. And I'm really, really encouraged by how much support I have received. And many faculty members at Stanford have expressed their concerns, and we have exchanged our thoughts, discussed. We organized various discussions about related issues, and we are very glad that President Mark Tess-Levin of Stanford University has responded to our concerns and reiterates Stanford's support to the international scholars, international community. And this experience made me realize that actually we can make some difference simply by speaking out, even if I, as someone who have never thought about similar related things and have never had any experience, and it still makes a difference, because even if I'm just expressing my concerns and seeking for help from my colleagues, it may help not only myself, but also others with the same concerns. At least it makes them feel less lonely if I speak up. So I'm especially thinking of the junior scientists, such as students and postdocs, who have either personal or scientific connections with China. I think it must be a very difficult time for many of them. And many of them may be strongly discouraged by this atmosphere to stay in the US. And I feel like it's really important that all of us who are concerned by this issue can make some joint effort to raise the awareness of the problem. It includes, like the US government needs to realize how this arbitrary expansion of actions against research security concerns may lead to irreversible damage to science in US in long term. And the universities and the research institutions need to realize that at this difficult time, they need to provide more support to the affected scientists. That's also necessary for them to keep the level of their research, stay leading in the research. And the public also needs to understand better how fundamental science is done, how fundamental science is different from classified technology. So hopefully we can all reach out and speak out in our own way, whether it's publicly or privately. Everyone has different situation, and even if we just talk to a friend, that's very useful. In long term, I think this kind of joint effort will make an important difference. That's all I want to say. Thanks, and I look forward for the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Xiaoliang. Okay, thank you all. I want to thank all of the speakers so far. This has really been terrific. And we're going to take a break now. Let's take a break until, let's say 3:15. And after the break, we're going to have a Q&A session. So I would just like to say something. So for the Q&A session, and please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, under Q&A and not in the chat. In addition to questions, we would really appreciate suggestions for what the APS and other scientific societies, Congress, funding agencies, institutions, departments, and colleagues could do to help promote a better, well, a healthier approach to research security. Already we have a suggestion for a request for a template of a letter that can be sent to representatives in Congress about the damaging effect of approaches to U.S. competitiveness. And so, Slake says that this template letter will be posted along with the recording of this webinar on the APS website. Okay, so that's a concrete thing that everyone can do. But let's come back. Please, in the meantime, post your questions in the Q&A so that we can get started right away at 3:15. Thank you. Okay, shall we get started again? I actually lost track of time. Sorry about that. Looking at all the interesting questions that have come in. We've had a number of questions. I think, why don't we start with just a very simple question, which is which is sort of distilled from a number of these questions, which is what can listeners do? And I thought it might be helpful for each of you to take this in turn. So just briefly, just give your ideas of what listeners can do. Xiaoxing, let's start with you.
I think one very important thing that listeners can do is to speak up. Because as I said, these policies fundamentally is because they have the support of broad public. And if we want to change these policies, we have to change mind. Just think about this series of webinars that started after the murder of George Floyd. And we have all seen that that event and the response to it has changed many people's minds. So if we want to change the policies that unfairly target Chinese scientists and the people who collaborate with China, then we need to achieve similar things, try to change mind. And for doing that, we will all have to speak up.
Thank you. Okay, Slake.
I mentioned in my comments that the APS voice is 6,000 voices strong. When I mentioned that, I was referring to the 6,000 APS members last year who joined in our advocacy activities. So they picked up their phone and called congressional offices. They sent a personal email to their representative, to their senators. They had meetings with congressional staff. And as a result, we won some battles, as I mentioned. So we have 6,000 members fighting for fair and just policies. You can make that 6,001, right? So when APS sends out an alert, you can join the 6,000, take action, make it 6,001. You can take that alert that we send out, share it with your colleagues, make it 6,020, but add your voice.
And let me add, it can help to make sure that the APS emails do not go to your junk email. Okay, Jim, you'd like to say something? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Point that has been the thread through comments. I just want to make sure that everyone viewing this understands the importance of speaking out in multiple fora. There was a meeting earlier, confidential meeting with high government officials who are responsible for science. And they actually asked that APS get involved in speaking to Congress, that our membership not remain inactive, that we have to be out there fighting for this. So we should do this.
I would just also like to say that, it would really help for Asian American physicists to run for APS positions. When I was on the council, I think I'm not one of the very few Asian Americans on the council. So more representation really makes a difference. Not only in the APS, but everywhere. Okay, let's see, David, over to you.
Well, I think I can only strengthen your remarks. I remember when I was president, we had a briefing from the FBI and the CIA at the PPC the Public Policy Committee of the APS, and I was shocked that there were no Asian Americans at all, zero on that group. And I brought in Andrea and Tao Han, and because physics, this is somewhat different from the other issues the APS is dealing with Delta Phi. Our universities are full of Asian Americans. They contribute in large numbers to the scientific effort in the United States, and yet, to some degree, they are underrepresented in our councils and in our scientific organizations. And partly this is because they, maybe come. I mean, Professor Shi discussed this from his point of view. He felt he was a newcomer and he didn't know enough to get involved. But also perhaps there's, if you come from a regime which is less democratic and more repressive, it might be a good policy to keep your head down. But that's not a good policy. You have to raise your head. And one way you can do that is to join and participate in an organization such as the APS and others. Make your voice heard. It's amazing that people will listen. So the reason our government, some of our sympathetic friends in the government ask for our help is that they're being bombarded all the time with these idiots who spout nonsense, and they have, they don't particularly are moved by their arguments, but they have a vote and they make noise. So do we. And we need to make noise with logic and reason and empathy.
Thank you. Thanks. Very well said. Sean.
Yeah, so I guess I look through the Q&A. There's one particular question which really hits me hard. This is a question from Xuan Chen. He basically said, as a Chinese researcher who has spent almost my entire adulthood in the US, I found it extremely hard to feel belongingness to the US after what all has happened in recent years. On one hand, I have my higher education connection in the US. I'm already familiar with systems, so naturally, I would want to stay here to continue my research. However, on the other hand, the climate made me feel unsafe. And so, indeed, this is you can see this alienation of ethnic Chinese researchers in the US. If the United States create a environment, the government continue to have this hostile environment, treating all of us, the ethnic Chinese, as spies, then I think this will create a chilling environment, will drive away many talents that will be vital to the health of the American scientific enterprise. I think this is what Professor David Gross and Professor Jim Gates said earlier about while you try to fight with your enemy, you end up hurting yourself first. That's just not wise. And so there has to be a climate change, as Professor Gates said, that the environment for ethnic Chinese in America needs to be changed to a more welcoming one, like that, the one that drew me and many others, and Professor Xiaoxin and Xiaoliang Qi to come to America. We wanted to, well, I'm a US citizen, then I wanted to make my voice heard. I have tried to reach out to Senator Reid and my senator in the state of Rhode Island. I'm going to continue to try to get a meeting with him to voice my concerns. And what's been proposed by Senator Cotton is extremely damaging to the United States. It's not helpful at all.
Thank you. Xiaoliang.
Yeah, so I guess the question we were discussing is what the listeners can do, and yeah, I just have one thing I want to say in addition to what we have discussed. I think in addition to the direct ways to try to influence the government policy, like writing the email to your senator, I think it's also important for everyone to speak out and influence the research institutions and just the public. Like if you have a colleague who is having some trouble, like what we see in these cases, it means a lot for them to get support. And the most important support is probably from their institution. We see that different institutions act very differently in these different cases. And it probably matters a lot, like if a lot of support comes from colleagues and tell the university or the institution that you need to provide more legal support, financial support in such cases, and rather than assuming anyone who is involved in the case is a bad guy. And so I think that's a really important way we who are members of university and research institutions can make an influence. And also just influencing the public by like talking to a friend. I mean, I understand many people, especially junior people, have all reasons that they may not want to talk publicly about this issue. They may have all reasons to be worried. But just talking privately with any friend, and even if you just convince one person who previously was like what Professor Xiaoxing she described, like you watch the TV and you assume someone who is charged must have done something wrong. If you change the mind of anyone like that, that's very important.
Thank you. I would just want to continue along these lines just a little longer with a question which I'm going to direct towards Xiaoxing, which is, if a colleague is being targeted or suspected of espionage, what can we do to support them through this experience? And what resources are available and who can we reach out to?
I think the case of Gang Chen is a very, very good example. Over 100 MIT faculties have written letters and published letters supporting him. And that is very, very important. To the person affected, I can say that from my own personal experience. I mean, that means a lot. The letters from Professor Chen's colleagues must have meant tremendously to him. And the other important aspect is that when somebody is charged, the general public immediately think this guy must have done something wrong. If his colleagues all came out supporting him and saying, well, he's doing what we all do, we're all Gang Chen, and a member of the general public read it will say, wait a minute, there must be something which is not correct in this case. So it really means a lot. So if a colleague is affected, get more of the colleagues and write letters and publicize it. And of course, sometimes somebody might have done something not right. But even if that's the case, we want to make sure that the justice is done right. And for that, of course, money is a big issue. So anybody, somebody will say, well, we're in the United States. If you are wrongfully charged, you have courts to defend yourself. Fine, hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million if you go to trial, or all the physical, mental, and all the stress. And so there are several successful fundraisers, and I do encourage people to support them. And because the cost is really very high. If you want to hire a good lawyer, I believe at least $1,000 an hour, and they add up very quickly. And so if there is an opportunity, I encourage everybody to support these people, even if they have done something wrong. We want the justice to be done right. We want the punishment to be adequate for the mistakes that they made.
Yes, great, thank you. So I want to shift a little bit to, there are a lot of people who have questions about, to what extent are certain activities that we regard as normal activities should people be careful about? For example, writing letters of recommendation for Chinese students and postdocs who are looking for positions in China, reviewing grant proposals, collaborating with scientists in China. And so I'm not quite sure who to direct this question towards. Jim would like to take that? Okay, thank you.
Andrea, I would indeed. In fact, I was also monitoring the Q&A and saw a question there actually from a very close friend along these lines, and I responded. And so let me just take this response to everyone that's listening. And none of the people on this panel are legal experts. And so the best thing that I can tell you, which is what I told my colleague, is that this, excuse me, that within your organization, there must be legal counsel and legal advice that is possible. So even, I agree with Sean that if you go for outside counsel, that's some fantastically financially daunting challenge. But within most organizations, there's a university legal counsel or organization legal counsel. Go and talk to them confidentially. David's shaking his head no, but that's the only thing I can offer to this. David?
Well, you're addressing Michael Peskin's question, where he was asked to write a letter of recommendation for a Chinese student, and he's asking whether he can be punished. So you're right, none of us are lawyers, but my opinion is that he definitely should write such a letter. Not only that, he should send a letter to the FBI and say, look what I've done. This is completely legitimate. It doesn't affect anything, national security. To some extent, we do have to fight back, especially on totally nonsensical policies like this. Writing a letter of recommendation for somebody who lives in another country, no matter what about his scientific merit, in no way can be illegal, and one really must, in my opinion, address this directly, and not simply, ask the FBI for permission to behave correctly.
But the assessment of possible
Yes.
blowback, right?
Lawyers usually give very conservative advice. I'm talking about, essentially political action.
I agree. You're talking about a different track.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's see. Here's a question. Suppose somebody is actually in the 1,000 Talents program and didn't think to disclose this to a funding agency. What would your advice to them be to do? Xiaoxing, I'm going to send that to you. Ask you.
I would suggest that find a lawyer and discuss with your lawyer about what's the best action to take. Transparency is very, very important. But under the current environment, how to talk to your administrator about some disclosure that you did not do previously, I mean, this become very tricky. So discuss with the lawyer. Find a lawyer and discuss with your lawyer about how to go about doing it. But disclosure is something that one has to do.
And I can follow up on this.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Indeed. So my own experience was when I received the offer from the China 1,000 Talent Program. The first person I consulted with was my department chair, and then basically we just discussed the good or bad of taking this, and that led to basically a discussion with the university deans. And so I think ultimately this question is really between you and your employer. It should really not be a U.S. government issue. Of course, now the government makes it an issue, then we have to follow the policy. So that's very clear. So if you are already in the China 1,000 Talent Program, you have not disclosed to the funding agency or your university, the first person you should talk to is your department chair and the university official, because ultimately you have to decide whether you're going to continue to teach in the US or you go to China full time. And then the China 1,000 Talent Program was really not a spy program at all. It's not a policy trying to be sneaky on the U.S. system. Rather, it's a talent program. They try to attract U.S. talent to work full time in China. So it's actually, in my view, a very honorable program. It's like Humboldt Fellowship in Germany, and then it's a Chinese government to try to help their university, their research institutions to attract top talent. So for people like myself, and I actually initially was tempted to go to work full time in Beijing because some of my friends already went, and then I thought there would be a healthy community for me to thrive there. But my wife didn't want to go. I had no choice, and then in the end, I had to settle a part-time arrangement with a university in China. That was permitted by my university. So I would urge you to talk to your university first.
Okay, great.
Well, but can I add?
Yes.
You know, like Xiaojiang Li from Emory University, he went to China to do the 1,000 Talents, and the first thing he did was talking to his department chair, and he had an email, and the university agreed for him to work part-time in China. And he got charged for non-disclosure because the government says that that email was just the starting point of agreement. And so he got charged anyway. So in the current atmosphere, I think still talking to a lawyer is the best first way to go. Right. And if you just go to talk to your department chair in the current atmosphere, I mean, previously, I agree, that's more than enough. But then, of course, you disclose everything. But in the current environment, the university is afraid of losing its funding. It's rather, many universities would rather overdo it rather than underdo it. And you might, they might report it to the FBI, and the FBI say, okay, there is absolutely sure evidence that you did not disclose. Let me charge you.
But Professor,
so let's maybe I just want to follow up on that, and this is really for Jim and Slake, which is the APS working with engaging with university administrators across the country to raise awareness and gather support for the issues discussed here, because all too often university administrators are actually not standing up for their faculty.
So let me respond. Slake, unless you want to step in here first, I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead, Jim, please.
So we, in leadership, APS leadership is actually very aware of this problem. The leadership cadre, all of us on the executive line have discussed this more than once. We have not formulated, to my knowledge, a program or a letter that could be sent to university administrators. This is perhaps a policy move that we should talk about in the board executive committee and bring to bear the wisdom of the leadership. It's a very interesting suggestion, but no, as of this point, we have not done so. Slake, you can take it here if you'd like.
Yeah, and I'll talk more about just the federal policies. So we are in the habit of working closely with the AAU and the APLU in our advocacy work. So in particular, we can together, working with APLU and AAU, we confronted some really damaging language that was introduced by Senator Portman. We got that to a little bit better place as best we could. We're working together and trying to push back on language that's in the Endless Frontier Act that was referenced by Professor Chi earlier. So at least when it comes to federal policy, we have been in the habit of working with our counterparts that represent universities, AAU and APLU.
Yeah, I mean, as John points, yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I think also APS is in the process of rolling out policies and training modules and all sorts of things for department chairs, which deal with the whole gamut of ethical behavior. And part of that, of course, is how to handle disclosures and transparencies and conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment, all in line with this idea that we as a community should take responsibility for this ourselves and not relegate it to the government.
Thank you, John. So following up on that, is another question. So we focused on university science, and there the concerns about maintaining the openness of research are real. But what about other physicists? So there are, of course, physicists at national labs where they are, quite well equipped to protect classified work. But what about physicists in industry, where theft of intellectual property really can be a concern? And what about faculty entrepreneurship? So what is the APS doing along those lines?
So I can respond to that one. And this is a really important question. So we are asking for recognition by policymakers that one size doesn't fit all, for the very reason that's behind that question. We can't treat espionage the same way we treat non-disclosure in a grant application. They are two very different things. One can present direct threats to U.S. national security or economic security. The other does not, right? So we're asking that they assess the risks and have a proportional response. And that needs to be part of however the federal government responds to research security. So that's what we're asking for.
I think the professional standards discussion, what does it mean to be a physicist? What does it mean to be an ethical physicist? What does it mean for transparency and disclosure? Those discussions apply to everybody. We have mostly academic members at the moment, but we are trying to make a broader home for the physics community, and these policies and the culture change that Jim is talking about would apply more broadly than just to the academic community.
Okay, here's a question about are Chinese students and postdocs and undergraduates in the US having difficulties with visas and other restrictions? I think, Slake, you're probably the best one to answer that.
Yeah, we have a lot of work going on around visas. We worked with Senator Durbin to develop legislation based on the feedback we were getting from international students about the problems that they face. And that legislation does two things. It changes, this will mean a lot to international students who have come here. It eliminates the single intent and replaces it with dual intent. That phrase will mean a lot to the international students. And it also provides a path to green card for students who get degrees in STEM. So we have an active advocacy campaign going on in that area right now. You can even visit our website, our policy website, and take action to promote that particular issue.
Great, thank you. So we have a suggestion here, which said it could be helpful for the APS to basically prepare best practices guidelines for people who are, for example, in the situation of applying for grant proposals or engaging in collaborations or whatever. So, you know, for people who are really not sure about how to handle this. Yes, Jim.
I agree that that's a great suggestion. It's a project that we have not undertaken. Part of the reason for doing these webinars, as we started last summer, is to get the input from all of the great minds that are out there in our audience. So we take these suggestions seriously. And there's not only is the session recorded, we also have records of the chats and the Q&A. So I think a number of the items that are in there will be a code for possible future policy and practice moves for the organization to make.
There is a program called the EP3, which is Effective Practices for Physics Programs. And those are more aimed at the programs themselves than the individuals within them. But clearly an effective program should also include training for the faculty who are writing grants. And so I'll make sure we follow up with that group to make sure that there's something included about research integrity and as it pertains to the discussion today.
Can I add, Andrea?
Yes.
No, I definitely support the ideas of making all these recommendations more complete and about the best practices and so on and so forth. However, on the other hand, it's impossible to have a recommendation that include everything. And so if you just think about the kind of things that people got charged for, it changes. Things are changing and dynamic. And so sometimes I like to quote this quotation from Ayn Rand's fiction Atlas Shrugged. It just says that one declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for man to live without breaking laws. So, you can make the guidelines to cover as much ground as you can. But if the Chinese scientists and students are seen as suspected spies, you will find something to charge you. And as I've shown, this non-disclosure, it's just at some point that DOJ decided that's the thing that they are going to go after. And so I think it's important, for example, for people in the funding agencies like NIH, NSF, I think they understand that non-disclosure, the majority of them perhaps are misconduct or whatever. They're not national security threats, most of them. And I think, I believe the people at FBI, they know that. They know that. But what they want to do is to say, okay, just like what this former FBI agent said, that they cannot prove that these people commit some kind of a theft of intellectual properties. So they just charge these people for these minor violations and just to disrupt them. And that's something that we need to speak up against, because it's not fair to scientists of Chinese ethnicity, and it's not good for Americans' research enterprise. So that's the thing that we need to change.
David.
I want to just emphasize this again. I agree completely that the attitude here is not to assume that the FBI's and DOJ, or whoever is making these regulations are rational and reasonable. They are attempts at intimidation. So let me give you an example that I was told by Steve Chu, who informed me that if you were receiving government funding now, and luckily, by the way, I am not receiving any government funding at this point in my career, thank God, you have to disclose honorary doctorates from Chinese universities. Now in China, a university is not able to give an honorary doctorate. Sorry, honorary professor is not able. It's illegal. They can't, give honorary doctorates. So when you're invited, as I often have been to Chinese universities to give a lecture to students, etc., they give me an honorary professorship, which is a piece of paper, okay, which says honorary professor at XX university, which means absolutely nothing. It's an honor. It's a payoff for giving this lecture. But that is regarded as something that must be disclosed as, cooperation with the enemy or something like that. That is the overtones of cooperation with the enemy, which was totally outrageous. And we cannot get into the position of saying, okay, that's a reasonable requirement, and we advise you all, if you get an honorary professorship at a Chinese university, to immediately disclose this to the FBI. Really is not the right thing to do, in my opinion.
Yes, Sean.
Yeah, okay, so what we're discussing is actually related to a question one of the audience asked earlier. I can't find it, that person. Basically, the person said APS is going to have a hard time to position itself in the current environment where China and the US are in conflict. So I think the United States as a country needs to decide, do we want to have scientific exchange with China? So that's the first question we need to answer. APS needs to make it clear it has a position on that. If our position is to continue to engage China scientifically on the academic ground, front, then what we do academically with Chinese colleagues should not be viewed with suspicion. And then so all of this attempt to punish us with jaywalking charges is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I do think the APS has made this position clear, both through statements and through its actions that Slake outlined earlier. I think the real question, though, is that that's really not enough. And it's really a matter of sort of educating the public and changing public opinion on this. And so maybe we need to wrap up pretty soon. I would actually like to maybe if someone could just briefly talk about, what do they suggest as ways to educate the public and convince people? This is the kind of thing often that has to be done person by person. And what are the best, most effective arguments to convince people that there is a problem and that open science is really important? So who would like to take this question?
Maybe I can say a wish I have. I think what's needed is a major outreach campaign. Perhaps APS can run that. Perhaps APS can get together with other professional societies to run some kind of a major publicity, public outreach campaign. Coupled with whatever seminars and documentaries or something like that. Of course, each of us can talk to our friends, but if there are this kind of a big scale outreach campaign to that effect, that would be great.
Okay, I'd like to end this just on the personal. We have a question for Xiaoxing, which is, can you share something about your current professional life? What have you done to recover from the U.S. government's wrong accusations against you? And what support have you received from your colleagues? And do you still receive research funding from the government?
Well, my research is much smaller than it used to be. And one of the reasons is I'm totally scared. And of all the boxes I have to check, all the report I have to write, because, for me, not only I experienced that, I have also talked to many people who have been charged, through my lawyers for me to give some references or maybe directly contact me and looking for lawyers. And so I just, I've seen so much, and I understand anything that you did not do perfectly. As I said, your life is under the microscope, right? They are trying to pick, a needle out of a haystack, and so pick a bone out of an egg. So if you have done anything wrong, you will be in trouble. So that makes it very, very scary for me to apply for funding. I dare not to apply for funding. I did a couple of them. I scared to death every step of the way. And so also at some point, I ask myself, what do I want to do for the rest of my life, which I hope there are still many years. I kind of think that if I can help the community, and that will be much more important than if I publish, a few more Nature Science. And so it's a conscious decision. It's kind of a calling that I want to tell people about this. When it just happened, when I talked to people about what could happen, many people didn't believe me. And now more and more believe that this is happening. So I think if my experience can serve the purpose of making people aware of the problem and start to speak up to defend the America's research enterprise, and to defend Chinese colleagues, and that will be worthwhile for me to do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Xiaoxing. I want to, Jim, would you like to say something? Go ahead.
To invite Xiaoxing to become more engaged with the APS. The APS is the organization that, in my opinion, is the vessel for physics, the physics discipline's culture. And when we have members who have the kind of experience that he has had, they can get involved directly with the organization in terms of organizing some of the things that, there have been wonderful suggestions in the Q&A about op-eds and what have you, but as Jonathan will tell you, the APS has a full plate, and it is a volunteer organization. It is powered by the commitment of our membership. So I would simply say that if he will just stay closely in touch with us, with ideas, he's likely to find a willing partner that will bring our organizational strength to realize these things.
Geraldine, thank you, Jim. Geraldine.
Yeah, along those lines, although this issue impacts all of us, one of the things that we wanted to do with this webinar is to really center the voices and experiences of those who are directly impacted. So I wanted to bring to your attention that there is a post-webinar survey that all registrants will get. And so if you are interested in sharing your experience, there's a question there that asks about that. So please respond to that question so that we can reach out to you and think about ways to highlight your experience and also raise awareness of the issues talked about today.
Yeah, so I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to all of the speakers today and for answering also these questions in the second half. I also want to thank all the people who attended today. For those of you who are of Chinese origin, I hope you got us to, have now can see what the APS is doing to help you, and how deeply those of us who are in the APS feel about supporting you, okay? How important it is to support you. For those of you who are not Chinese, really thank you for all of your, for your attention and willingness to help support your Chinese colleagues. And because this is something that involves all of us. So thank you again so much. Geraldine, do you have more to say? Would you like to close this up?
I think I'll go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to thank the APS for the support.
Andrea, you might remind our viewers that they can recommend to their colleagues and friends that they can watch the recording of this webinar.
Yes. So everybody who is registered will receive a link to this recording. As we said before, when you go to that link, you'll also see a template letter to write to Congress about this. But you can also share that link. Please share that link very widely. We really want people to know about this. And so really thank you for attending today. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.